going to start working our way through the different energy systems and kind of what they're doing and when they're being used. So the first one, again, first one that's going to get tapped into, and this is always going to start out any one here, but again, it comes back with high intensity activities as the Phosphagen system. So again, high intensity activities up to about 30 seconds of activity, but generally the beginning of an activity or any of these ones here, again, if it comes back to high intensity, we may kick this back in a little bit here or there, but again, generally high intensity activities, very, very short activities. So what is going on here is it is a way to use basically an enzyme and a substrate phosphorylation thing going on here. So what we're doing here is we have creatine with phosphates on them, and through the use of an enzyme, we can take the phosphate from here, put it onto ADP to give us creatine without the phosphate and ATP. This is an incredibly quick way to put a phosphate back onto ADP. So again, really quick ones here. This is the system in something like a 100-meter dash or doing a bench press real quick with high weight. This is the system you're going to be tapping into. There is another way that we can do this a little bit here. You have something called myokinase. It's another enzyme that can take a phosphate from an ADP and put it on a different ADP. And this will let us get a little bit more ATP and convert that ADP to adenosine monophosphate. Again, it is a very low capacity system though when it comes to that one. So it's again another one here that can give us a little bit more of that substrate level phosphorylation. Again, that glycolytic system or the glycolysis system, this is generally going to be using carbohydrates, blood glucose, and glycogen from the muscle to take that and break it down to produce ATP. Again, mid-level to high-intensity activities, generally going to be one of those that you'll see kick in at the beginning of an exercise as well, up to about 2 to 3 minutes of activity before the respiratory and cardiovascular systems come up to speed to support a steady state oxidative system type of energy. Again, anytime you're getting slightly hypoxic in the tissues, this is what's going to kick in. Again, what becomes an issue on this one, and this is why it can only be used for a certain period of time and generally the intensity level will have to drop, is that it does give you a byproduct that is normally used in the oxidative system, which is pyruvate. If you don't have enough oxygen present, you can't take this pyruvate and convert it through the Krebs cycle and all that to generating more ATP. So what this means is we need something to happen to the pyruvate. And what we do with this one is it's a type of fermentation in the muscles. It's called lactic acid fermentation. We are going to take some of our electron carriers that we need available in order for glycolysis to continue to happen. We have to get those hydrogen ions off of them. So we put them onto pyruvate and convert it to lactate or lactic acid. Generally, if there's enough oxygen present, we are going to go into the Krebs cycle, the mitochondria, and we're going to convert this fully through those whole energy metabolic pathways to generate a lot more ATP. So when you don't have a ton of energy demand and there's enough O2, we'll continue with that pyruvate through the Krebs cycle, generate more NADH, those electron carriers, and convert that to ATP. So again, with fast glycolysis, it's going to be occurring when either really high intensity or reduced oxygen availability. It's going to convert this to lactic acid. Lactic acid can a lot of times accumulate in the tissues and lead to some issues with the intensity level staying at that height in those tissues. We're going to see it is not a waste product. It is something that can be used by other tissues that have sufficient oxygen as an energy source. Things like the liver, things like the heart. Again, as it continues to accumulate, we also get a lot more hydrogen ions here. These ones start inhibiting these reactions. It interferes with calcium binding to troponin. All these things are going to kind of mess with the efficiency of the muscles and make you not able to maintain that level of intensity. And this is part of the reason if you start out and you start running a flat out sprint over a certain period of time, you are going to slow down. And it's mainly because as we get a buildup of these waste products, the muscle can't contract as efficiently or as forcefully, and you're going to be required to start slowing down. Again, lactic acid is going to get converted to lactate by different systems in the muscle and in the blood. And again, this lactate is not fatigue producing. Lactic acid in the acidic environment of the muscles will cause those muscles to work less efficiently. But this can be used by certain types of muscle cells that we'll get into later on. Some of these type 1 fibers that have more myoglobin and things like that. We'll get into that later on. The other thing that we'll see is this can be used by cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle does not really go anaerobic. We have good enough blood supply, enough oxygen that really the only time it ends up being anaerobic is if you're undergoing what's called angina, you're getting hypoxic in the heart and you're having a heart attack. Again, lactate is also used by the liver to do gluconeogenesis. Take that and other things here and convert them to glycogen or glucose, so we can use this during extended exercise or during the recovery to start kind of putting back stuff to that pre-exercise state. Again, normally at rest, lactate levels, unless there is a disease state going on or something else like that, are generally going to be rather low in the bloodstream. And again, I'm not worried that 0.5 to 2.2 millimoles per liter. The main thing that can happen though with incredibly high intensity exercise, you can about 12 to 15 times the level. Generally what we're going to see is blood lactate levels. If you were looking for these and testing for them, if you're doing an exercise about 5 minutes after you stop is when they're going to reach their peak. Again, after you've stopped, there's still going to be generating a little bit. It's going to get out into the bloodstream. It takes a little time for it to diffuse in there, so you'll see that peak after a bit here. Again, generally done by a blood test. Blood lactate levels can accumulate following high intensity activities, like it says there. Generally, you're going to stay lower with continuous exercise. So again, with the oxidative system, we're going to be using really the entire energy pathway of the cells. Again, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, but using oxygen at this point. And again, generally this is going to be for longer term activities. So stuff that I like to do, like running, cycling, long distance swimming, not sprints. But anything that's taking a little bit while longer, you're mainly going to get into an oxidative type of setup here. So things like I said, longer than 2 to 3 minutes. Your heart rate, your breathing rate are generally going to come up enough that you can supply enough oxygen. Again, with the exception that you're not increasing the intensity to the point that there's not enough oxygen to provide the ATP. Again, intensity goes high enough, you're going to actually switch or start bringing in some more of those anaerobic systems to try to make up for that deficit. So again, we can use a number of different things, and again, how this is going to work and what's most efficient, again, it's going to depend somewhat on intensity. Generally, so CHO is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates pretty preferential, especially as we start getting slightly higher intensities. Fats are also one of those that are usable with the oxidative system. Not as much, but can be used. Proteins as well. Again, happening in the mitochondria, that power plant of the cell, to do the video that everybody's seen at this point. Again, needs oxygen. It needs the breathing rate and heart rate up enough here to have it happen. Again, generally, when you're not being active, this is the system that you're usually using for generating ATP. Again, low intensity activities, sustained activities, generally using this. Again, depends on intensity. Usually it's going to be fats and some carbs. As intensity increases, we're going to shift more and more carbohydrates into this. Again, I always kind of refer to these as, with the aerobic system, as the two gas tanks. Carbs are one of the gas tanks. Fats are the other one. Carbs, they're able to supply it a little bit for the amount of oxygen, they can supply more ATP for the amount of oxygen that you're bringing in. So these tend to be favored as the intensity level increases. That being said, fats are, it's a much larger gas tank. You have a lot more fat, even if you're not carrying much body fat, you have a lot more fat stores available for generating ATP, and you can do quite a long sustained activity, much longer than you would think. But again, it's all about intensity levels on these ones, which gas tank is going to get used preferentially. And again, as the intensity increases, the shift goes to more and more carbs. We'll talk about later on, there's actually tests you can do where you look at the amount of inhaled oxygen versus exhaled oxygen and carbon dioxide, and depending on the ratios on some of that, you can actually determine which fuel source the body is using. It's called respiratory exchange ratio. So again, something we, on these years where we're not having a pandemic, I've been able to hook people up to a mask. We've been able to do some of this stuff here. I'm not going to do that this semester. We're going to try to do some other things that maybe will give you an idea where it would be at, but we can't really, I'm not going to hook people up to a mask and do that in the lab. It's just not something we're going to do. Again, prolonged states here, sooner or later, and well, that's one of the things we'll see later on too, there is a limited storage of the gas tank for carbs. So over time, even if you are doing a low intensity activity, you will use up those carbs and be required to use fats. And again, this system is much more efficient. So oxidative system is generating a lot more ATP from a molecule of glucose than the glycolytic pathway is. But again, it requires more oxygen, and again, if the body's not supplying that or cannot supply enough, we're going to have those other systems kick in to make up the deficit for the ATP that the body's requiring. Either that, or the body is going to have to decrease its intensity and slow down, which does happen also. And again, as I was saying, all these systems, it really, they're kind of all on this little spectrum, and there's a kind of this nice inverse relationship. So the one that can generate ATP the fastest has the least amount of capacity. The one that has the most capacity is the slowest to generate the ATP. So it really, again, is this spectrum of duration and intensity that are really important on this. So the Phosphagen system can generate ATP really quickly, but it has almost no capacity, so it's going to run out incredibly quickly. Fast and slow glycolysis, both of these can generate ATP relatively quickly. That being said, there's not a ton of capacity, more than the Phosphagen system, but not as much as oxidative pathway. And again, oxidation of carbs versus oxidation of fats. Oxidation of carbs is going to be a little bit quicker, can provide that ATP a little bit faster. But again, it starts running out of capacity at about 2.5 hours of that level of intensity of activity, where fats and proteins cannot produce them quite as fast, but it's a very close to, I mean, unless you're starving or something else like that, it's a pretty, or you're doing something for days and days and days and weeks, the capacity is pretty unlimited in reality. And again, showing you this idea here when you're looking at duration of these different ones here in terms of which one's doing what in terms of oxidation, glycolysis, Phosphagen system. Again, time as well as intensity. So higher intensity, you're going to favor those fast producing systems that do not have a lot of capacity. As we go to a more steady state, you're going to start favoring those systems that are able to have a much higher capacity but don't have the speed. And if in the middle of a nice easy run you also pick up and start sprinting, you're going to switch over or start favoring the glycolytic and the Phosphagen pathway. You're going to start favoring that to be preferentially producing the ATP for that increased intensity. So again, it's not just one is working, then that one shuts off and something else goes on there. They're all working, again, dependent upon time and intensity and what you're doing at that particular moment. And again, shows you power output, what's going to be anaerobic or not. So few seconds here, 100% intensity, you're using almost entirely anaerobic mechanisms, very little aerobic, so very little oxidative. You can see as time goes out, intensity level decreases. We start favoring more and more aerobic and less anaerobic. And again, saying it a number of times here, but again, I'm trying to make it very clear that it's all about intensity and time. So which system we're going to be using and which one's kicking in there. So higher intensity, again, favors those quickest systems. As the intensity decreases, favors more of this. And again, we're going to see if we were extending out how long could these last. Oxidative can last weeks in reality. And again, kind of talking about systems here. And again, a lot of this also goes back to different energy systems, and we'll get into this as we go further on here. This also is part of the reason that as you start training for specific ones here, if you're really trying to train that phosphagen system, you're going to see here you have to do a rather long rest period in order to let that system recover. So you're taxing it, letting it recover, taxing it again, where oxidative system, the rest to exercise period, you can do a relatively short rest period. So again, it's all dependent upon time and intensity, and as you start to train to develop one of these systems, that intensity versus rest is going to be a big part of how you would tailor the training on to tap into one energy system versus another. And that's one of the things that I've learned as running, and I've developed training plans for different people that were running marathons or other races. It's one of the things you need to pay attention to when you're doing a particular run, is to do it at the paces that are being specified, in that if you run a easy run too fast, you're actually training a different energy system and not getting those adaptations that you're actually looking for. And the thing is, all these ones, they can run out, with the exception of probably fatty acids. I mean, sooner you can run out of those, but that's going to be a rather long time. So ATP, creatine, phosphate, glycogen, all these things can be depleted over time. Again, the creatine phosphate system, it's rapidly depleted with high intensity exercise. So like I said, they're 50 to 70% during high intensity exercise. If you go to like sprint until you're exhausted, you've basically depleted that entire system. Again, the ATP levels in the muscle don't decrease all the way from their initial value, even during that intense exercise. And we're going to see it's over about 3 to 5 minutes, up to about 8 for full resynthesis. You can basically have this system fill back in and be completely back to pre-exercise state. And again, that's why when we were looking at those intervals to train the system on the one there, 1 to about 12 in terms of activity versus rest. You need to, if you're doing a 10-second sprint, you're going to have to wait 10 times that. So 120 seconds before that system's back in order for you to hit it again to get a full training effect on it. Glycogen is stored in the muscles as well as in the liver. This is one that we'll talk about in the last part of this too. Glycogen is the body's way to store a little bit more glucose. So it's a form of animal starch. You have a bunch of these glucoses hooked together in a molecule. Again, if you start getting slightly anaerobic, you can start training to increase these glycogen stores. Like it says here, during moderate to intense activity, it's the amount of muscle glycogen that's in the muscle that's being tapped into. As you start going for very long-term exercises, so things like marathon training, it's actually the liver glycogen and that lower intensity that ends up being more important. Again, to completely glycogen deplete, especially on a long-term activity, this is going to be 2 to 3 hours of activity to try to wipe out systemic glycogen. I mean, you're never going to wipe it out completely, but to get to that level where you've brought it down to really low levels. And again, recouping the system, it's going to take a little bit of time. Usually, I mean, if you really tap it down, it's going to take up to 8 to 24 hours probably. But again, it's very dependent upon diet. If you are eating enough carbs for the system to be replaced, it's going to happen. If you're not bringing in the dietary needs to recover this system, it's going to take longer. Like it says there, muscle glycogen maybe within 24 hours, like I said, if the diet is sufficient. Longer if you're not bringing in enough carbs to replace this. And like I said, glycogen depletion, long duration. So like I said, marathon training, something like that, running a marathon, you're not working at a particularly high intensity, maybe 70% of your max. You can see ATP and creatine phosphate, not particularly important. Muscle glycogen is probably the biggest limit. Muscle and liver glycogen are going to be the limiting factor on this one. This is one, if you try to run it too fast, you might tap these out. It's preferentially used as glycogen over your fat. And that's where, if you've ever heard of hitting the wall, I'll tell stories about that later on. I've done it a number of times. It's not enjoyable. Where you can see as you start getting these shorter distances and higher intensities, you can start seeing what becomes the more key things here. So 400-meter run, it's the pH in the muscles that becomes a limiting factor. You can see repeated fast things here. It is really the creatine phosphate system and muscle glycogen that's limiting. So again, all these things, we'll get into it later on. You can preferentially try to tap into these energy systems to train them specifically. Again, requires different types of intensity and duration to actually try to train these different systems and bring about those adaptations that we're going to talk about. So really the last kind of stuff to talk about here is this kind of the breathing and required after that. So if you get up to a steady state of activity where you're being pretty much aerobic, there is going to be a certain period of time where you tap into, at the beginning of this, into the creatine phosphate system, into those anaerobic type of metabolisms in order to generate that ATP. That creates an oxygen deficit, so you're going to build up some lactate and other stuff that the body is then going to need oxygen to convert back afterwards. And that's where you get into this excess post-exercise oxygen uptake. So what that's really saying is why your breathing rate is up after you stopped exercising. If anybody's went for a run, you know when you get done, you don't just get done and go and go back to normal breathing. After you get finished, you're breathing a little bit more. That is that oxygen debt, and that what you're paying back through that exercise increased oxygen uptake is that oxygen deficit. You can see on low intensity ones, it's not that much of it, where if you do a very high intensity activity, you can see the amount of oxygen consumption required gets much higher. And because of that, that pre-exercise, that post-exercise, increased breathing is going to go on for longer. So if you do something that is incredibly intense, you're going to have that post-exercise breathing rate be much higher for a longer period of time relative to the amount of exercise that you did. Again, just getting into how we are going to have to recover these energy systems. And this all goes back to the idea, it's pretty much an evolutionary idea, but in any system, what the body's going to try to do is recover that energy system as quickly as possible. Because what you don't want to have happen is that you did this run and, okay, you ran 15 minutes and now you have to sit stationary for an hour and a half. Evolutionarily, that is not a good thing. So if there's predators around, that's not a good thing. So what the body usually does is, as quickly as possible, is going to try to get these things back to as much of a pre-exercise state as it can. So if you did have a need for a fight or flight type of thing here, your body is ready to go again. So we can kind of see here with these higher intensity ones, it is going to take a little bit longer to recover those. So the last thing we'll look at here is a little bit of that glycogen depletion and how it relates to blood glucose levels, and finish up some of these ideas of bioenergetics. So I'll see you next time.